Hi, Jason Lammer with Coldwell Banker Commercial. If you missed the 2021 Real Estate Symposium, we recorded all of the sessions. I'm pleased to provide this session with Congressman Jay Obernolte. Jay, how are you doing?
Great to see everybody. If only
Likewise, and congratulations on your win.
feels like condolences lately, but thank you.
Well, how's our district doing?
The district is recovering. I think the focus, as it is across the country, is getting to a place where we're reopening our economy, we're getting our kids back in schools, and that's been a challenge. It's I'll talk about some things that are going on at the federal level that impact that and impact the real estate market. Good news is that we 2 weeks ago extended the PPP program. That was done with existing money. So it was something that had broad bipartisan support and was a bill that I co-sponsored. So I was happy to see that happening. Good news is that Congress passed this year, as I'm sure everyone knows, a large relief package that included about $180 billion for healthcare, for vaccine manufacture, vaccine distribution, further vaccine development, protective equipment, and healthcare workers. Bad news is that $180 billion was only about 9% of the overall package. The overall package cost was almost $2 trillion, and that included a wide variety of different programs. Particularly, a quarter of that package, or almost $500 billion, was for money for state and local governments. And that was something that I really fought against, because if you look at what's going on here in California, I mean, I think it's a perfect illustration of why this is such a bad idea. California, as I think you heard Smitty mention, is doing quite well. I mean, we had, I was vice chair of the Assembly Budget Committee the last 5 years, so I can talk with authority about the finances of the state of California. And California does not need the money from the federal government. California has a $15 billion budget surplus in the budget that was introduced in January. And the state controller reports that in just the month of January, tax collections were $10 billion more than forecast. So California is doing great from a financial standpoint. And yet the federal government is going to ship California over $60 billion in coronavirus relief funding. And every one of those dollars is going to have to be borrowed. So that's one of the reasons why I was so adamantly opposed to the coronavirus relief package. That's unfortunately a trend in DC this year, is increased spending. And we're seeing it on a very partisan basis, which, I'm a bipartisan guy. I like to reach across the aisle. I find it very unfortunate to be in DC and seeing so little of that happening. Congress passed last year 3 coronavirus relief bills. All 3 of them had broad bipartisan support. But this bill was passed through a process called budget reconciliation that allowed it to be passed without a single Republican vote, which I think is very, very regrettable, because bipartisanship has a purpose. So we're now talking about a further $2 trillion in spending. The Biden administration introduced an infrastructure package that you probably heard about this week that purports to make a new investment in the nation's infrastructure. And you would think that infrastructure should be a bipartisan issue. I mean, we all kind of have this understanding that government exists to do collectively the things that we're unable to do individually. And that means building roads, building bridges, building hospitals, building schools, right? So this is something that we're all willing to invest in. But unfortunately, if you dive into the details of what the Biden administration is proposing, you find it's exactly the same situation as the coronavirus, relief package, where very little of the package actually goes towards infrastructure. In fact, I was adding up yesterday the different amounts and found that only about 6% of that additional $2 trillion in infrastructure spending actually goes to roads and bridges. About 2% goes to dams, 5% goes to broadband. You might think, okay, well, what's the rest of the package go towards? Well, almost a quarter of it is a huge expansion of Medicaid. So, I mean, obviously, that is not an infrastructure bill. Over $200 billion for new low-income housing, which is going to unfortunately increase federal control of local housing markets. I know that's something that your members care about. $100 billion of additional funding for schools that we just passed the schools. These are reopening funds. in addition to the funding that we just appropriated. So, this is very concerning. And, the reason for my concern about this overall federal spending is this, and this is something that I think everyone in your industry cares deeply about. First of all, dumping a bunch of money into the economy is highly inflationary. And if you want an illustration of the danger that we're in, you can look at what economists say about stimulus spending. So, last year we were in a mild recession. Back in 2008, we had the Great Recession. And that was the last time we as a country had this debate about how much federal spending should be used to stimulate the economy. And so economists have weighed in on this. It's been a very researched topic. And when you look at an economist and ask them, how they calculate an appropriate level of federal spending, this is what they'll tell you. They'll say, okay, what you do is you take the peak gross domestic product right before you entered the recession, and then you look at the trough, the low point of gross domestic product for the country. So that the peak to trough represents how deep the recession is. And you want to aim for about half of that in federal spending. That's a safe number. So, that's the way of getting the federal government, using the federal government money to stimulate the economy, decreasing the depth of the recession without overheating the economy or, overcorrecting on the other side. So if you look at what the federal government did in 2008, the gap between peak and trough GDP was about $80 billion a month. And the relief packages that were passed were on the order of $35 to $40 billion a month. So it was just about right where the economists had recommended the spending be set. So if you look at where we are right now in our milder recession, we are about $50 billion a month below peak GDP right now. That's going to decrease as things reopen to about $20 billion a month by the end of the year. But right now it's about $50 billion. If you look at the package that just passed Congress last month, just that spending package alone, combined with the spending packages from the previous year, that is injecting about $150 billion a month into the economy. Okay, so that's 3 times the peak to trough GDP gap. That's 6 times the amount that economists recommend as being safe. So, I mean, that's the concern. That could lead to a resurgence in inflation. That will certainly lead long-term to higher interest rates as there's more competition there and the economy overheats. And that's bad for real estate. It's bad for a lot of different things. So that's one of the reasons why I am so vehemently opposed to it. And I also think it's important to recognize that every single dollar of this spending is borrowed. So we already run at the federal level a budget deficit every year, right? A substantial one. And we have a growing and very substantial national debt. As most people are aware of that, I don't think most people realize the magnitude. So last year, the country passed a national debt size of over 100% of our gross domestic product. So to give you an idea of how big that is, we haven't had a debt that big since the end of World War II. And it's continuing to grow. It's about $28 billion now, and that's before any of the Biden infrastructure spending, should that pass. To give you an idea of, like a benchmark for how much that represents, if you take that and you divide by the population of America, that means we owe about $85,000 for every single American. And it's growing. So that's the concern. Something has got to be done about that. So I actually last week introduced my first sponsored piece of legislation in Congress. It is a constitutional budget amendment that would amend the Constitution to require that the budget be balanced over a period of 5 years. And it also has an off-ramp for times of economic disaster and distress. That Congress can override the balanced budget requirement by a 2/3 vote of both chambers of Congress. So that's an effort to try and bring bipartisanship back, since it's rare, if ever, that one party will have an advantage of more than that. So that's going to start getting committee hearings. It's, I'm not sanguine about my chances as a freshman of getting something like that passed. But I mean, this is a discussion that we need to have, because something has to be done about this national debt. The Congressional Budget Office put out a forecast last year, and it has not been updated for this last round of spending yet. But even last year's forecast said that on the path we're on, before the year 2050, it's going to require more than 10% of our GDP just to pay the debt service on our national debt. So think about that. 10%, not of the tax revenue that the federal government collects, but 10% of everything our country makes will go towards not paying down the national debt, but just paying the interest on the national debt. So, I mean, that should be of concern to everybody. A particularly concern to your industry, I would think, is the increased taxes that are being proposed as part of this infrastructure package. Unfortunately, I might, although I'm against increased taxes and usually against increased spending, at least I would have something to talk about if the package was completely paid for by increased taxes, but it's not. They're paying for a portion of the package with increased taxes on corporations and other entities. And I think they're doing this because it's a popular thing, right? If you're going to increase taxes on somebody, then politically you want to increase taxes on the other guy. And that way, when you poll people, if you say, should we increase taxes on you or on these evil corporations that are making all this money? People say, well, increase taxes on corporations. But I mean, you're a more sophisticated audience. You know that corporations actually don't pay tax. The investors in those corporations pay tax because the corporations, they make a profit, they pay tax on the profit, and then they distribute the profit in terms of dividends to their investors. So higher corporate taxes means lower dividends to the investors, which means more money captured by the federal government at the expense of funds that could be put into the economy and used to purchase homes or whatever. So that's the big danger in that kind of tax increase. One thing that you will be happy to hear is a part of this infrastructure package is the repeal of the $10,000 cap on the deductibility of state and local taxes, what we call the SALT deduction. So, I mean, that's something that's gotten a lot of attention because it really penalizes residents of high tax states such as California. So it's been very, very controversial. And I think it's an interesting debate. I actually support doing away with that cap because I do think it's unfair to residents in our state. I mean, our state, it's not our fault that we have a state government that sets taxes as high as they do, right? So, and yet we pay the price. Our government doesn't pay the price. However, I also think that you have to think about this in the context of the philosophy of, why state and local taxes should be deductible. And I always remind people that there's really no philosophical reason why you should be able to deduct state and local taxes on your federal income tax return. In fact, when I was in the legislature, I was co-author of a bill that we called PEPPER. And we came up with some silly acronym, to make it work, but we were contrasting with SALT. And what the bill did was to make federal taxes deductible on your state income tax return, just to illustrate the hypocrisy of the state government saying, oh, well, these taxes should be deductible for federal purposes. Because if you think about, we're all business people, right? You think about a business, when you pay royalties on a business, you don't deduct the royalties you paid from one person to the royalties that are due to the next person. If you make $1 and you owe 8% to this entity and 6% to this entity, that's the way, it's just a straight up calculation. So, I mean, it is kind of a strange discussion to be having of this whole philosophy, but that is something, if I had to pick one positive thing that might come out of this infrastructure package, it is that. Also, that infrastructure package actually has not actually been introduced in the House yet, and we will have to see what legislative path the Biden administration chooses for it. I was actually on television a couple different places this week urging them to not use budget reconciliation to do this, because if they introduce it as a budget reconciliation bill, that will be an admission to the entire world that they intend this to be another partisan process. And I would really love to see this be a bipartisan bill because I think infrastructure is a bipartisan topic, but we will see. I'm not terribly optimistic that they're going to take my advice, but we should see in the next couple of weeks when that bill package actually gets introduced. So I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. Also want to remind you that my district office is here for you. We have a fully spun up district operation now. I was very fortunate that all of my district staff elected to come over with me from the Assembly to Congress. I wish I could say that it was seamless from a standpoint of House administration. I guess House seats must not turn over very often because you would not believe the bureaucracy and red tape involved with just getting the phones transferred over. It took us over a month. They wouldn't even start it until I was sworn in. It took us over a month to get the phones working. It's incredible. It's like it's like a cautionary tale about federal bureaucracy. But we are fully spun up now, and if you ever have a problem with any branch of government, we'll help you figure it out. But particularly anything having to do with the federal government, please remember that the reason why you have elected representatives is so that you have a voice in your corner when you have a dispute with government. And it's amazing how often that comes up. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have about anything going on in DC.
Congressman, thank you very much. Not surprised you actually did the math on a bill. That's probably a rarity up on the Hill, isn't it?
I don't know. Actually, in the legislature, I was the guy that read every bill, and they told me that wasn't going to be possible to do in Congress. And I said, well, we'll see about that, challenge accepted. But what I have found is it's incredibly difficult, much more difficult to read every bill in Congress. And it has nothing to do with the workload, and has everything to do with how messed up the federal process is. First of all, there are times when there was one time 2 weeks ago, and I'm not joking. Okay. If you told me this a year ago, I would have said, no, that's hyperbole. I literally, there was a vote called, and I had to start walking across the street to the Capitol to make the vote without even knowing what bill the vote was on. Okay, I didn't even I was going to the floor to vote without knowing what I was voting on. That's how messed up the House calendar is. In fact, the speakers changed the calendar in terms of like when we're in DC and when we're in the district. It's already been changed 10 times this year. It drives me crazy. So that's one challenge. And then another challenge is that when you read federal legislation, it is never in context. When in the legislature, if you go on the page, the website where you can get access to the text of all the legislation that's been introduced, there's a tab. If you select a bill, you can see the text of the bill, and then there's a tab that you can click on that will show it to you in context. But at the federal level, there's none of that. And so you'll be reading a bill, and the bill will say in Federal Code section 13024.7, page 64, line 4, insert the words except for federal contractors, right? And you're like, okay, what does that mean? How do you read it? And there's no way of getting that in context. So it's incredibly time consuming to make heads or tails of actually reading federal legislation. So it's been frustrating.
I'm sure that's no coincidence. They don't actually want you to understand the bill, or more importantly, the voters, correct?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how calculated it is. I think that it would have been changed if more members were interested in reading that themselves. I have a much larger legislative staff now. When I was in the assembly, I only had the funding for one single legislative staff member, so my legislative director. Now I have actually a legislative team. I've got an LD, I've got a couple of legislative analysts, and I've got a legislative correspondent. But what I've found is that I actually have less legislative horsepower, per bill, per task than I did when I was in California. And the reason is that the task is just so much more daunting. I mean, to give you an idea, we get about 100,000 on the pace we're on. We're going to get about 100,000 constituent inquiries a year regarding legislation that's pending. And I didn't get close to that when I was in the assembly. Maybe people don't know what an assemblyman does or care less about what goes on in the legislature. But I mean, here, someone will write in and say, hey, I urge you to vote no on HR 1234. And so someone's got to answer that, because, I have a philosophy that every single constituent inquiry gets answered, and hopefully quickly, right? Every single email, every single phone message, every single person that messages us on social media, I want to answer everybody. So, someone's got to figure out what our position is going to be on HR 1234, if we have one, why we're taking that position, and then get back to our constituent that says, yes, I do plan to vote, no on HR 1234. It's a terrible bill, and here's why, or, whatever the reason is. So, I mean, just when you multiply that out and you figure out how many people it takes to make that happen, we actually have less ability to analyze legislation in my congressional office than we did in the assembly.
That's too bad. But 6%, I'm not surprised, but I'm shocked. I don't know if it's one of those numbers you hear, it's shocked that only 6% is going to go to infrastructure, but then you realize that's kind of the name of the game. You call the bill one thing and it really is something else. So it's what's the old adage, Trojan horse? I
didn't say 6% infrastructure. I said 6% on roads and bridges. There's other infrastructure money. But when you add it up, it's way less than half the bill. So you're right. You can't call this an infrastructure bill if you're being honest about the amount of money that's actually going to things that any of us would call infrastructure.
All right. We'll look forward to seeing you represent our district. Again, congratulations. And to our audience, I truly mean it. Congressman, very humble. Glad you're representing us. Look forward to years to come. And I can tell you, I reached out to his office personally on an issue that we were having with the federal department on responding. And I think it took about 1 week by the time that his office actually got a result, responded immediately. Very impressive. And Congressman, thank you very much for coming on today.
Well, thanks. Great to see everyone. Look forward to seeing you guys in person as we reopen.
Likewise. You take care now.